After 4 years of occupation, war was closing in on the small town of St. Lo. After a month of savage fighting, the Allies were in a virtual stalemate with the elite German SS units, boxed in along their Normandy beachhead. U.S. General George Patton boasted, "Take St. Lo and we'll be in Paris within 2 weeks." St. Lo was now the prime objective for the U.S. First Army to break this stalemate. Before St. Lo could be taken, it was necessary for the Americans to capture the commanding heights that surrounded it, including the prevailing Hill 192. From this peak, the Germans held critical surveillance, enabling them to monitor the Allies' movements. The challenge ahead for the Americans was savage. General Joseph Lawton Collins, a veteran of the Pacific Theater, remarked that the irregular patchwork terrain called bocage was as bad as anything he had seen on Guadalcanal. American tanks could not penetrate the thick walls to accompany infantry assaults. As a result, the infantry was compelled to go over the top in near suicidal frontal attacks. Regardless of the challenge, Hill 192 was to be taken. Success was key to the Allied breakout of Normandy. The Hell of the Bocage. After the successful D-Day landing in June 1944, the Allied troops faced tough challenges as they moved inland from the Normandy beaches. The U.S. First Army, under General Omar Bradley, tasked with pushing out of the coastal area south of Omaha Beach, was having far more difficulties in crushing the German defense than they had expected. Although they achieved their initial goal of capturing the port of Cherbourg, which they did by the end of June, this victory came at a cost. The fighting had worn down the American troops, with the main fighting yet to come. As July began, the First Army was stuck in a small area of Normandy, much smaller than the Allies had planned. The British forces on their left flank, who were supposed to capture the city of Caen, were also facing difficulties. The Caen area was heavily defended by German panzer divisions, and the British had not yet broken through. In an effort to slow down the American advance, the Germans recognized that the terrain around the Vire River was perfect for defense. They concentrated their limited forces, especially their best panzer divisions, in the British sector near Caen, leaving fewer troops to face the Americans. This meant that the U.S. First Army, which was further west, faced less opposition, but in a terrain full of thick hedgerows, which turned the fighting into a true nightmare. These hedgerows, known as bocage, were a distinctive feature of almost the entire Normandy landscape. Simply put, bocages were natural walls made of earth and plants, which acted as barriers that blocked the advance of the troops. However, it was not only the thick bushes that blocked the advance of American troops. There were also sunken roads that added to the problems. They were practically deep ditches between the fields and bocages, often muddy and very difficult to cross for both infantry and tanks. Despite all the difficulties, the Allies had no other option but to keep trying to make a decisive push to break through the German defenses. Any other scenario would have led to a disaster and the collapse of the Western Front in Europe. In this effort, the small town of St. Lo became of utmost importance. St. Lo. Located in the heart of the Bocage region, St. Lo served as a major road junction, connecting several key routes in Normandy. Capturing St. Lo was essential for the Allies to secure their lines of communication and supply, which were vital for the success of further operations in France. For the Americans, capturing St. Lo was necessary to break out of the Bocage and into more open terrain. The dense hedgerows surrounding St. Lo had made the advance slow and costly, but taking the town would open up the way for Operation Cobra, the planned breakout from the Normandy beachhead. In the open plains beyond St. Lo, the Allies could finally bring their superior mobility and firepower to bear against the Germans. The town's capture would also disrupt German command and control in the rest of Normandy, as the town served as a hub for the defensive operations. By taking St. Lo, the Allies would force the Germans to retreat from their positions in the Bocage, paving the way for the liberation of the entire Normandy. Finally, the village's capture would also serve as a significant morale boost for the Allied troops. It would be seen as a sign of progress in the Normandy Campaign after the heavy fighting in the Bocage region. Capturing St. Lo would certainly be an important step toward the larger goal of liberating France from German occupation. For these reasons, both the Americans and Germans thoroughly prepared for the battle. Battle plans. The American plan to capture the town of St. Lo was the key detail in the preparation for a larger offensive known as Operation Cobra. This operation would enable the Allies to break out of the bocage and into more open terrain. This campaign involved three First Army Corps, 7, 8, and 19, which were supposed to operate on a long front line leading from St. Lo over to Carentan to Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte. The unit tasked with capturing St. Lo was the U.S. Army 29th Infantry Division. They were to push through the heavily defended German positions and seize St. Lo. However, before the ground attack would commence, the plan called for the use of artillery and air support to weaken the German defenses and lower the morale of the defenders. The U.S. command knew that the terrain around St. Lo with its hedgerows and narrow roads would make the advance difficult. Therefore, they prepared for a slow and methodical approach, moving from one defensive position to the next. The U.S. forces aimed to encircle and isolate the village, making it harder for the Germans to hold their ground. However, to ensure that each phase of the attack could proceed smoothly, they had to pay great attention to close coordination between infantry, artillery, and air forces. As mentioned, the 29th Infantry Division, also known as the Blue and Gray Division, played a leading role in the battle for St. Lo. This division was responsible for attacking from the west toward the town. It was supported by the 30th Infantry Old Hickory Division, which also engaged in the battle from different directions to help encircle the village. On the left flank, the 29th Infantry Division was supported by the 2nd Infantry Division from the neighboring V Corps. The 29th Infantry Division was divided into three regiments: the 115th, 116th, and 175th Infantry. The division had support from artillery units and engineers to assist in breaking through the hedgerows and dealing with obstacles. The 30th Infantry Division, known for its strong fighting capability, was assigned to attack from the north and east of St. Lo. This division included the 117th, 119th, and 120th Infantry Regiments. Their job was to put pressure on the Germans from multiple sides, making it harder for them to hold their positions. Once captured, St. Lo would be used as a springboard for the final breakthrough from Normandy. The Germans, too, recognized the town's strategic importance and knew that holding it was crucial to slowing down the Allied advance. It was why they built strong fortifications around the town, relying on natural features to their advantage. The Germans turned the bocage around St. Lo into a network of defensive lines with bunkers and machine gun nests along key routes and positions. Bunkers were positioned behind hedgerows and camouflaged, making them harder for the U.S. forces to spot and destroy. The Germans also set up outposts in the forward hedgerows to detect and slow down the American advance. These outposts were lightly manned but could delay the enemy, allowing time for the main defensive positions to prepare for the attack. Within the town of St. Lo, the Germans reinforced key buildings to be used as machine gun nests and observation posts during the attack. The Germans also created a patchwork of anti-tank obstacles and mines around the town to channel Allied tanks and vehicles into pre-planned kill zones where they could be destroyed by German anti-tank weapons. The Germans expected the Americans to attack hard with infantry and tanks in order to break through these defenses. To counter this, they planned to use small, mobile groups of soldiers who could quickly move to trouble spots and launch counterattacks. The Germans relied on their knowledge of the terrain and their ability to reinforce positions quickly to hold back the American advance. In this effort, they set up reserve forces that could be moved quickly to any part of the front that was under threat. These reserves were kept in nearby villages and wooded areas, ready to reinforce the front line if necessary. On the German side, the primary units defending St. Lo included the 352nd Infantry Division. This division had been engaged in combat since D-Day and was significantly weakened by the time of the St. Lo battle, yet it continued to put up fierce resistance. Another key unit involved in the defense was the town of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, made up of well-trained paratroopers. The German command was well aware that the battle for St. Lo would be a fight to the last man, and they were prepared to make the Allies pay dearly for every inch of ground. The capital of ruins. On the evening of July 6th, the U.S. Air Force launched the first in a series of raids to bomb the town of St. Lo. The goal was to destroy German defensive positions, including bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. Until the morning of July 7th, B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators dropped thousands of bombs, turning most of the town's buildings into rubble. The destruction was so severe that it made the town almost unrecognizable. However, despite the destruction, the bombing did not completely eliminate the German defenses. Many German soldiers survived the bombing by taking cover in bunkers, basements, and other fortified positions. What's more, they used the rubble and destroyed buildings to their advantage, turning the remains of St. Lo into a defensive stronghold. Turning the town into a ruin had more than one unintended effect. The rubble and craters also created more obstacles for advancing American troops. Once they entered the town, their movement through their streets was extremely hard. But the bombing of St. Lo left the most devastating impact on its inhabitants, who failed to receive warnings about the incoming raids. Hundreds of them lost their lives during the bombing, and many more were injured. Those who survived were left without shelter and basic necessities. The town, once a vibrant community, was reduced to ruins, with its people struggling to survive amidst the devastation. Estimates are that 95% of the town was destroyed, earning it the grim nickname the capital of ruins. The tragic destiny of St. Lo left a strong impression on many people, primarily in the Allied countries. One of them was famous novelist Samuel Beckett, whose short poem titled St. Lo serves as a haunting reflection on this destruction. Vire will wind in other shadows, unborn through the bright ways tremble, and the old mine ghost-forsaken sink into its havoc. The Americans continued their bombing campaign until July 10, 1944, by which time the village had been almost completely destroyed. It did weaken the German defenses and contributed to the overall effort to capture St. Lo, but at a great cost to the local population, who endured immense suffering. The fighting begins. On July 7th, 4 days before the 29th Infantry Division would commence its attack, the 30th Infantry Division forced the Vire River, aiming to push the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division to the south and straighten the front line at St. Lo. Despite challenging conditions, including flooded ground and a lack of air support due to poor weather, the 117th Infantry crossed the river. It was followed by the 120th Infantry, which secured the crossings at the Vire-Taute Canal, thus extending the division's foothold. On July 9th, the German forces attempted a counterattack, but it was poorly coordinated and ineffective. The 30th Division continued its advance, with Combat Command B, CCB, of the 3rd Armored Division moving slowly due to cautious maneuvers through the Bocage terrain. Despite the challenges, the division maintained its momentum, securing key positions and preparing for further advances. The 30th Division continued to push forward, but the advance was difficult, with the enemy fighting fiercely to hold their positions. By July 11th, the division was still engaged in intense fighting, making slow but steady progress towards their objectives. On July 11th, 1944, the attack on St. Lo began with the 29th Division leading the way. Major General Charles H. Gerhardt, commanding the 29th Division, focused the main attack on the left flank, aiming to avoid costly street fighting in St. Lo by capturing the high ground around the city. The terrain was typical of the Bocage country, with thick, high embankments that made visibility and movement difficult. Already early in the day, the 29th Division faced determined resistance from German forces, who launched small but fierce counterattacks. Despite the intense German resistance, which apart from counterattacking included minefields and flanking fire, the 2nd Battalion of the 116th Infantry made steady progress, using a combination of artillery support and innovative tank maneuvers to break through the hedgerows. By late afternoon, the 116th Infantry penetrated the German main line of resistance and positioned themselves for a further advance. The 115th Infantry, however, faced a tougher challenge. After being delayed by a German counterattack, they encountered strong German defenses at La Luzerne and Bellefontaine. The 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 115th Infantry struggled to make headway, with heavy casualties reported by the end of the day. As night fell, the 116th Infantry had pushed towards the Martinville Ridge, and the 29th Division prepared to continue the assault the next day. The opening day of the attack on St. Lo was marked by slow but steady progress, with the 116th Infantry achieving a decisive breakthrough that set the stage for the continued push toward the city. Equally important to the success of the 116th Infantry was the securing of Hill 192 further east on the highway leading from St. Lo to Bayeux. The attack on the hill was led by the 38th Regiment of the 2nd Infantry Division. Despite the heavy resistance from the well-entrenched Germans, American soldiers slowly but steadily moved up the slopes of the hill. The key role was played by American tanks, which broke through the hedgerows with the help of the engineers. After a day-long heavy fighting, men of the 38th Infantry captured the hill and thus secured the road leading to St. Lo from the east. Slow going. After the initial success of the opening day of the battle, the American forces were beginning to taste the real fight. The German 3rd Parachute Division offered strong resistance, slowing down the U.S. advance and causing high casualties. The bocage terrain made the fighting even harder. The U.S. infantry had 3 ways to move through the hedgerows: walking down the road, crawling through the gaps, or rushing across the field, with each method being unsafe. The roads made the soldiers feel exposed. Gaps were often heavily guarded by the Germans, and rushing across fields left them open to machine gun fire. On July 12th, the 29th Division continued its push towards St. Lo. They faced 3 parallel ridges that the Germans were defending. The 116th Infantry was positioned on the Martinville Ridge and Highway Ridge, from which they could see the town in ruins. The 1st Battalion of the 116th faced heavy resistance as they moved through a draw between the ridges. German tanks and 88mm guns caused many casualties, and by the end of the day, the battalion had made little progress. The 175th Infantry tried to pass through the 116th to continue the attack, but they too were delayed by strong German artillery and mortar fire, which made it difficult to move forward. The German defenses were well organized, and the U.S. troops found it hard to coordinate their attacks. Miscommunication added to the confusion, with some units unsure of their neighbors' positions. By July 13th, it was clear that the attack on St. Lo was going to be slow and costly. The 175th Infantry restarted their attack without tank support and under bad weather. The Germans, positioned on the parallel ridge, could see the highway and direct their fire accurately. Progress was slow, and despite the efforts of U.S. artillery and engineers, the infantry could not break through. The fighting continued on July 14th, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The U.S. troops tried to regroup and prepare for another attack. The 115th Infantry, attacking southwest from La Luzerne, faced entrenched German troops. After a long day of fighting, the U.S. troops finally broke through German defenses, but they were exhausted and made little progress. On the same day, the 35th Division entered the battle on the opposite western side of St. Lo. They also encountered a German strongpoint around a local church, which took hours of artillery bombardment to clear. The Germans had set up a deep defense, using the hedgerows to their advantage. The fighting was brutal, and progress was measured in yards. By July 14th, both the U.S. and German forces were exhausted. The American troops were regrouping, preparing for another attack, while the Germans were holding on, trying to keep their defensive lines intact. The battle from St. Lo was far from over, and the fighting would continue with both sides determined to gain control over the town. Lost Battalion. On the morning of July 15th, the 29th Division attacked with all 3 of its regiments. The main effort was shifted from the left to the center, focusing on Martinville Ridge. Martinville was a small village on a ridge, about 2 miles from St. Lo. The area was heavily defended by the Germans, who had dug shelters and dugouts along the hedgerows. The 116th Infantry Regiment led the attack on a narrow front, advancing towards St. Lo. The 175th Infantry was ordered to hold its position and support the 116th with gunfire, while the 115th Infantry attacked from the southwest to protect the flank of the 116th. The 3rd Battalion of the 116th Infantry led the attack along the ridge, but they were immediately hit by German artillery, which concentrated its fire on Martinville Ridge. German guns were causing havoc on the ridge because American observation planes could not locate and direct the return fire. The infantry and tanks supporting the attack were suffering heavy casualties. As evening approached, General Gerhardt ordered the advance to continue. The 116th Infantry regrouped and attacked again at 7:30 p.m. The 1st Battalion attacked on the left side of the ridge road, and the 2nd Battalion attacked on the right. They managed to push forward, but division headquarters, concerned about the severe enemy opposition, ordered the regiment to stop and consolidate their gains. The 2nd Battalion, under the command of Major Sidney Bingham, had made a significant advance by the time the order was issued, almost reaching their objective near the St. Lo Bayeux Highway. However, the advance created a large gap between the battalion and the rest of the regiment, allowing the Germans to take the opportunity and cut them off. The 2nd Battalion, with some 400 men, of which 35 were injured, found itself surrounded. Germans cut the wire communication, leaving them only with a radio to maintain a connection with a regiment command post. For the CP, however, the battalion was lost, as they didn't know about their whereabouts or the condition of the unit. Thanks to the brave effort of Captain King, who sneaked past the German troops during the night, the battalion commander learned that Major Bingham had established a defensive perimeter and was waiting for further orders. Meanwhile, the 35th Division had better luck on the left flank, advancing towards Hill 122. Despite stiff resistance, 2 battalions of the 134th Infantry reached the outskirts of St. Lo. General Bod, commanding the division, organized a task force to attack Hill 122. After heavy fighting, the Americans gained control of the north slopes of Hill 122. Despite the great effort put in by American soldiers, the overall situation on the battlefield remained uncertain. Back on Martinville Ridge, General Gerhardt decided not to pull the 2nd Battalion back. Instead, he planned to attack the Germans from the north and east to push them off Martinville Ridge and relieve the isolated battalion. Unfortunately, the attack of the 115th Infantry on the morning of July 16th was met with strong resistance. The regiment gained only about 300 yards. Even worse, the Germans launched a counteroffensive, trying to prevent the 29th Division from reaching the 2nd Battalion. The first attack included 3 tanks and about 100 paratroopers armed with flamethrowers. Soldiers of the 1st Battalion of the 116th Infantry fought back, stopping the enemy infantry before they could use their flamethrowers. The second attack hit the battalion's right flank, guarded by the Alpha Company. Alpha Company was in a tough spot, having lost all of its officers the previous day. The company was led by 1st Sergeant Harold E. Peterson. When a German tank attacked their line, it caused panic among the soldiers who started retreating. However, in the manner of a seasoned commander, Peterson regrouped his men and led them back to their position. Using rifle grenades, he scored 6 direct hits into the German tank and forced it to retreat. Despite heavy losses, the company ultimately managed to hold its position. The 2nd Battalion, still isolated, held out under artillery and mortar fire. They received some food, but their situation was dire. They had 35 wounded men and only 3 aid men to care for them. Blood plasma was dropped by planes to help the wounded, but some men died from lack of proper medical care. On July 17th, General Gerhardt ordered a renewed attack to relieve the isolated battalion. The 3rd Battalion of the 116th Infantry, led by Major Thomas Howie, was ordered to break through to the 2nd Battalion while being supported by the rest of the units. The 3rd Battalion attacked at 4:30 a.m. on July 17th, advancing through a thick fog that covered the slopes of Martinville Ridge. Major Howie instructed his men to advance in a column of companies, using only bayonets and grenades to minimize the noise and avoid drawing enemy fire. Only 2 men in each platoon were allowed to fire their weapons, and that too only in an emergency. This tactic, combined with the fog, allowed them to move stealthily through the enemy's main line of resistance. Despite the machine gun and mortar fire from both flanks, Howie's strict orders to avoid engaging the enemy helped them slip between 2 German companies and reach the 2nd Battalion. Once they arrived, they shared their rations with the isolated battalion, but were unable to provide much-needed ammunition, as their mission was to continue the advance towards St. Lo. Major Howie recognized that the 2nd Battalion was too weakened to lead the next phase of the attack, so he prepared his unit to take the lead. However, shortly after issuing orders for the battalion's next move, Major Howie was killed by enemy mortar fire that struck the battalion's command post. His death was a significant blow to the morale of the battalion. The 1st Battalion, back on Martinville Ridge, tried to send supplies through to them, but faced heavy German artillery fire. The 175th Infantry also attacked to close the gap between their position and the isolated battalions, but made little progress. By the afternoon, the 175th Infantry had suffered severe casualties, and the attack was halted. Isolated and low on ammunition, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions were in need of an evacuation, as they faced a severe threat of being overrun by a German counterattack, supported by tanks. However, both battalions created a reinforced defensive perimeter. With the help of effective artillery and air support, they repelled the German assault, restoring some hope among the American soldiers. St. Lo falls down. As much as the American soldiers were exhausted from 7 days of bitter combat, the situation on the German side was far worse. Already on July 15th, the German 352nd Division, which was responsible for holding a crucial sector at St. Lo, reported that it might have to retreat to protect its forces. Despite their best efforts, by July 17th, the situation had deteriorated further and the German lines began to falter. Realizing that the Germans were on the verge of collapse, on July 18th, General Charles Corlett of the 19th Corps ordered General Gerhardt to take St. Lo. Comprising various units from the 29th Infantry Division, General Gerhardt assigned Task Force C to secure the city. As Task Force C moved closer to St. Lo, they encountered weak German resistance, which they easily contained and continued their advance. At 1800 hours on July 18th, Task Force C entered the east end of St. Lo. They encountered scattered rifle fire but quickly secured strategic points within the town. The German defenders were taken by surprise by the speed and boldness of the American advance. By 1900 hours, St. Lo was firmly under American control. However, the town was yet far from safe for American forces. With much of the town reduced to rubble, danger lurked from everywhere. Americans had to spend another 2 days clearing out German snipers and pockets of resistance, not to mention the German shelling. On July 19th, the 35th Division took over from the 29th Division in St. Lo. The German forces had been pushed back, but they still held positions on the high ground south of the town. The Germans attempted to regroup and establish new defensive lines, but their strength was severely depleted. The 352nd Division, which had suffered heavy losses, was no longer capable of mounting a significant defense. The American forces continued to secure the area, and by July 20th, they had a firm hold on St. Lo. The 35th Division organized defensive positions along the WWII River and prepared for further advances. The Battle of St. Lo was finished. However, the victorious American soldiers were given no time to rest on their laurels, nor to mourn for their fallen comrades. And in the Battle of St. Lo, many had fallen. In the period from July 7th to July 22nd, the 19th Corps casualty toll went beyond 11,000 men, of which more than 3,000 were killed in the battle. However, the importance of victory these brave men paid with their lives was enormous. The fall of St. Lo opened the door to the Allied victory in the Battle of Normandy and the ultimate fall of Hitler's fortress in Europe.